Buckle up, guys. This one is going to get crazy. This is True Crime Matters with Tara Marie. I am Tara Marie, and it is so nice to have you back. Thank you so much for joining me today. So there's some huge developments in the Scott Peterson case. So much so that I'm actually really surprised more people aren't talking about this. Now, over the summer, many of you may have seen there's been 2 new documentaries that were released about the case. One is called American Murder, Laci Peterson on Netflix, and another is a Peacock series called Face to Face with Scott Peterson, which was essentially the first time Scott has spoken to the media about his case in 20 years. Now, first of all, for those who need to catch up on the case or would like to hear a deep dive on the case, I'll link them in the section down below. But to give a brief overview, Scott Peterson is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murders of his pregnant wife, 27-year-old Laci Peterson, and the couple's unborn son, Connor. Now, Laci disappeared from the couple's Modesto, California home on Christmas Eve in 2002, and sadly, 4 months later, her and her son Connor's bodies were discovered along the shores of the San Francisco Bay. Now, just weeks after Laci disappeared, police discovered that Scott had just started having an affair with a 27-year-old single mom, and they had been seeing each other for about 3 weeks by that point.
Amber Fry went public about the romance after seeing all the stories about Laci Peterson's disappearance.
I met Scott Peterson November 20th, 2002. I was introduced to him. I was told he was unmarried.
Police worked with Amber to record private phone conversations between her and Scott, which were later used during his trial. Now, many people found that those tapes were pretty incriminating. In fact, it is widely believed that those tapes are what ultimately led to a jury finding Scott guilty of first and second degree murder. Now, with this case, the prosecution really relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, since no forensic evidence incriminating Scott Peterson was ever found. Scott was sent to San Quentin's death row in 2005, but has always maintained his innocence and has been staunchly appealing ever since then. Then, 16 years after his conviction, Scott was resentenced to life in prison because a California Supreme Court ruled in his favor that the trial judge for his case had improperly dismissed jurors from sentencing if they oppose the death penalty, which is a major unconstitutional error. So that's up to this year. And what a year 2024 has been for Scott Peterson. Exactly 20 years post-conviction. It is truly explosive because on January 17th of 2024, the LA Innocence Project shocked the world by filing a near 1,000-page motion to the San Mateo County Superior Court declaring that they were representing Scott Peterson. The LA Innocence Project stated that they were investigating Scott's claim of actual innocence and that Scott's state and federal constitutional rights were violated. In the motion, the key requests from the LA Innocence Project team were for the DA to allow them access to specific evidence from the time of trial, which they say Peterson has never had access to in over 20 years, which he should have had access to at the time of trial. They were also requesting access to certain pieces of evidence they wished to do DNA testing on. Now, I have already covered major parts of that initial motion at length, and I'm going to link that down below as well. It contains a lot of the actual court documents and evidence never heard before, as well as new declarations just made by people involved in the case. So if you haven't seen any of those, I highly suggest, if you're going to go deeper into this case, you start back and watch those first. But for this video, I just wanted to get caught up with the latest in the case, and that is the judge's recent order, which is pretty incredible. Now, most notably, one of the biggest, never-before-heard bombshells that came out in January when this motion was filed is the fact that the LA Innocence Project was alleging that the prosecution withheld major pieces of exculpatory evidence in the original Peterson trial in 2004. If you don't know, exculpatory evidence is evidence that supports a defendant in a criminal trial and tends to show that they're possibly not guilty. This includes, but is not limited to, things like witness statements, cell phone records, or closed-circuit TV footage. Now, if the state does not turn that evidence over to the defense, it's known as a Brady violation, which is named after a 1963 Supreme Court case of Brady versus Maryland, which determined that the government's withholding of evidence that is material to the determination of either guilt or punishment of a criminal defendant violates the defendant's constitutional right to due process. So, therefore, if a prosecutor either knowingly or accidentally fails to disclose exculpatory evidence, it undermines the fairness of the entire trial and can result in the reversal of a conviction or even the dismissal of charges. That is because if a jury did not hear that evidence, they did not hear all the proper evidence to make their informed decision. Essentially, it means the state took away the right of the people to know all the data before making their decision. Should a Brady violation upset anyone? Yeah, it really should. Now, for the past 20 years, the defense for Scott Peterson has claimed a burglary which occurred across the street from the Peterson home, the same time frame Laci disappeared, had everything to do with the murders. However, the defense just couldn't prove it, which largely was due to police claiming the burglary occurred 2 days after Laci's disappearance on December 26th. During their investigation into the burglary, police mainly went off the statements made by the burglars, who claimed they were there the morning of the 26th, and without having further data to prove otherwise, simply took the criminals at their word. Now, the problems with the theory of the burglary occurring on December 26th, 2 days after Laci's disappearance, are many. For starters, it would mean that the police were listening to the claims of known repeat offenders who had major substance abuse issues. Stephen Todd, one of the burglars, told investigators that he was, quote, so high on meth and crack for 3 days that I don't remember anything I did, end quote. Another problem is that multiple witnesses reported seeing suspicious individuals in a white van parked outside the Peterson home the morning of December 24th, the same day Laci disappeared. Additionally, 2 days after Laci vanished on December 26th, there was already an established media and police presence outside the Peterson home. Court TV reporter Ted Rowlands has repeatedly stated that he was personally standing outside the Peterson home the early morning hours of December 26th, when the burglars claimed to have burglarized the home, and Rowlands maintains that he saw nothing out of the ordinary that morning. And finally, the actual burglarized homeowner firmly believes that the burglary took place on December 24th for multiple reasons. The biggest one being that Stephen Todd, one of the burglars, stated that the reason why he picked the home to be burglarized is because the large amount of mail that was sticking out of the mailbox. The burglarized homeowner, Susan Medina, stated it was on December 24th that she specifically made sure her work mail was sticking out of the mailbox in such a way that the mailman would pick it up prior to Christmas Day on the 25th. Mrs. Medina said that when she returned home on December 26th, there was no mail sticking out of her mailbox. I also just wanted to mention something I believe is incredibly important about the burglary, and that is the homeowner, Susan Medina, and her husband stated that aside from thousands of dollars worth of items being stolen from the house, much of which was like heavy lawn equipment and even a 200-pound safe, there was also 2 guns stolen and about $30,000 in cash that was stolen, never returned to them, even though the burglars were caught and went to prison. And several of the other items were returned to them. But the point I'm trying to make is this wasn't just some regular burglary. $30,000 20 years ago is the equivalent of about $50,000 today, considering inflation. It also means that the burglars would have been armed with guns that morning. Now, how many times have we heard of home invasion stories or abduction stories, where the victim is approached with a gun to threaten them to quietly going where they are told, come to my car with me and nothing will happen.
Surveillance video out of Modesto of a home invasion suspect breaking down a door while children were inside. And that's where the video stops. This happened around 7:30 this morning at a home near McClure Road and Clogston Way. Family members say a 13-year-old girl was home with her 3-year-old brother when the suspect started to break in. The girl called police, but not before the suspect and 2 others managed to break in. The family says the suspects then held a gun to the young girl's head, demanding money. But once they realized she'd already called 911, they grabbed a few items, then ran off.
Live pictures out of Modesto tonight, where police are on the scene of a home invasion robbery that ended with a shooting that injured a man.
This is all happening near Vito and Leo Avenues. Around 6:30 tonight is when this began. Police are still on the scene looking for evidence. Back out live now. Police say multiple men broke into the home here and then struggled with the man before he was shot.
A violent home invasion back in September. The victim's family has now shared the devastating surveillance video showing what happened, including how they faked being deputies.
Robbery in broad daylight.
A hostage held at gunpoint.
Guns pointed at police.
And an older couple kidnapped from their own home.
An Oakland family is on edge tonight after an attempted home invasion turned into a shooting.
This expectant mother we'll call Ms. Garza may give birth to her first child any day now.
We've been wanting it for so long.
The soon-to-be baby boy was her primary concern back on August 15th when confronted by this home invasion suspect armed with a knife who hopped a fence before sneaking into her home through an unlocked window after lurking in the backyard.
I heard the dog start barking.
Garza says she confronted the suspect after waking from a nap despite his warning to stay in the bed, pleading with him to spare her and her unborn son. As you can see in the dramatic surveillance video, the suspect places Garza in a chokehold before she falls to the floor.
He stole my wedding ring.
Police say the body of a 17-year-old boy kidnapped during a home invasion has been found. Officers say that the remains of Jesse Camacho were located on Monday in a rural part of Maricopa County. Camacho was taken by 2 gunmen just over a week ago.
So to me, it's not that hard to imagine something like that could have possibly happened. Now, one of the other odd things is that police arrested suspects of the burglary identified as Stephen Todd and Glenn Pierce just days after, on January 2nd. However, these 2 white men arrested for the burglary did not match the description of the 3 dark-skinned individuals witnesses noted seeing that morning near a white van parked outside the Peterson home. There was also a confidential police informant who told police on January 2nd that more than 2 people were involved in the burglary. The informant named someone with the first name of Mark. Also interesting to note was that an anonymous person returned one of the stolen guns to the police station on January 2nd after the 2 men were in custody. Now, for the past 20 years, one of the biggest claims of Scott Peterson's defense lawyer, Mark Garagos, was that on the very day Scott Peterson was convicted, the prosecution suddenly handed him exculpatory information from a prison guard lieutenant named Lieutenant Aponte, who claimed he had worked with Modesto detectives, and handed them an audio tape of a phone call between an inmate and his brother, which he had recorded. To the best of his recollection, he claimed that the brothers, Sean and Adam Tenbrink, were talking about Laci Peterson missing, and Adam mentioned that Laci happened to walk up while a guy he knew, Stephen Todd, was doing the burglary, and that Todd made some type of verbal threat to Laci. Now, this lieutenant says he made a recording of the conversation and immediately contacted the Modesto Police Department and left a message on the tip line. And when he didn't hear back, he called again, and the police tip sheet does indicate those calls. Now, this lieutenant says a detective from MPD came down to the prison and interviewed the inmate Sean, and he is 99% sure he made a copy of the audio tape. However, none of the detectives have ever admitted to doing this, which is utterly baffling to so many people. Firstly, why are police denying that this tape existed? Why would a lieutenant make this up? And secondly, why was this exculpatory evidence not handed to the defense until the day of the conviction? But by far, one of the most explosive pieces of exculpatory evidence withheld from the defense was new evidence that the Los Angeles Innocence Project just mentioned in their motion this year. And that was the apparent bloody mattress that was found inside a burned-out van that was discovered 12 hours after Laci went missing about a mile from the Peterson home. And it gets worse. The address where the burned van with the bloody mattress was found was literally right outside the alibi location of Stephen Todd. It was his sister-in-law's home, and he claimed that he was there at the home the morning of December 24th. Now, this is the mind-blowing part. The truth is, the only reason why this evidence is even known to Scott Peterson's defense team is because of an investigative journalist named Mike Gudgel. Mr. Gudgel is an award-winning investigative journalist who, from the very beginning, was a little bit baffled by this case because, in his opinion, something was just missing. It wasn't adding up for him. So in 2016, while he was researching the case, Mr. Gudgel discovered that another case was oddly cross-referenced with the Peterson case in the Modesto Police Department police files, and yet he had never heard about it. So he decided he would investigate it. When he dug into that police file, he discovered it was regarding a van fire found the morning of Christmas 2003 in Modesto. So, curious to learn more about that investigation and why it was connected to the Peterson case number, Mr. Gudgel went and personally knocked on the door of the original Modesto fire investigator who worked the case. His name is Brian Spitolsky. And when they met, that investigator, Spitolsky, had quite a lot to say. See, he said the Peterson case has always troubled him, and he added that he has always been deeply troubled when he was never called as a witness by either the prosecution or defense at trial. And they discussed the case a little bit further. The journalist Gudgel showed the investigator, Mr. Spitolsky, the police file, and right away, Mr. Spitolsky said, now, wait a minute. There's a lot of missing things in this police file. Firstly, he claimed there should have been a lot more photos that were taken at the scene that were clearly missing from the police file. Secondly, he said it appeared all of the items that were missing from the police file were relating to apparent blood evidence. Spitolsky explained to the journalist that it wasn't just a van fire. It was obvious the fire was meant to destroy evidence of another bigger crime. And the photos he claimed were missing indicated some kind of a bloody crime scene. The second alarming piece of evidence missing from the police file were photos from a luminol test he had done on site, which he knew came up as presumptive positive for human blood. He also added that he knew for a fact that the police chief was present during this investigation, and when the luminol test came up as presumptive positive for human blood, everyone in the room went, as he put it, ballistic, thinking it could possibly have something to do with Laci Peterson's disappearance. Now, once journalist Gudgel had all of this information from the fire investigator, he immediately reached out to Scott Peterson's defense team. And it was at that point that Scott's defense team reached out to the DA's office to obtain this evidence, which was exculpatory evidence and should have been available to them at the time of trial. But even then, the prosecutor still did not hand over the complete case file for over a year. After multiple requests, journalist Gudgel had to then obtain these bloody mattress photos and luminol photos from an anonymous source. And in January, the media kind of went wild with these reports because this was completely new information to anyone following this case.
Brian Spitolsky is now a private fire investigator, but Christmas morning 2002, he worked for the Modesto Fire Department and was sent to investigate a van fire that he still thinks about to this day.
We didn't have a fire that would be accidental.
It came just one day after and less than a mile away from where Laci Peterson went missing from her Modesto home.
But it wasn't that I thought it was connected. It was that it was close enough and it should be looked at.
The van and blood Spitolsky recovered from it are a main focus for the LA Innocence Project, which took on Scott Peterson's case in January.
Was it obvious to you right away that there was blood in the back of the van?
No. The only reason we were able to see this piece of fabric was because there was a metal container on top of the mattress, and it left a perfect circle for where that container protected it. Had that not been there, this wouldn't be happening.
In court documents, attorneys described the mattress with stains that tested presumptively positive for blood, saying only a very small portion of the mattress fabric was tested for DNA, which was insufficient to determine whether DNA from Laci and her unborn son Connor was present.
Well, imagine my shock when I found out just a few years ago that it did test positive for human DNA. I literally got goosebumps and the hair on the back of my neck stood up because it does mean something. It is significant.
The significance to Spitolsky has not been properly investigated. This started to keep him up at night.
To be fair, this wasn't brought up in court. And if it's relevant, I would want somebody to say something about it.
In court filings, the LA Innocence Project alleges police systematically ignored evidence that did not support their theory of Peterson's guilt, which includes refusal to investigate who set the van on fire.
And the van fire evidence has become a huge argument point for the LA Innocence Project. Now, in May of 2024, there was a hearing in which the Los Angeles Innocence Project requested DNA evidence done on 14 pieces of evidence related to both the burglary and the van fire. And here's a list of those 14 items they were requesting. Number 1, cloth from mattress, and that is the one that was booked into evidence under Modesto Police Department case number for Peterson, cross-referenced with the van fire. Recovered from the back of the orange van located in an alley at 612 Thrasher in the airport district of Modesto. Limited DNA testing on this item was conducted in 2019 by stipulation of the parties, and the presence of human DNA was detected. Additional testing is needed. Number 2, a piece of partially burned mattress cloth, also recovered from the back of an orange van located in the alley of the airport district. Number 3, cloth from van fuel tank. Number 4, metal fuel container in the center of a mattress located in the back of an orange van. Number 5, target bag recovered from the area near where the remains of Laci Peterson were discovered on the same day, which bore the same distinct odor of decomposition detected as emanating from the remains of Laci Peterson, and from which 4 packages of marine debris were collected. Now, that wasn't the target that you're thinking of. It was actually a very large bag. Number 6, duct tape recovered from the target bag. Number 7, 4 packages of debris collected from target bag. Number 8, 50-inch long tape or twine, about 6 inches wide, recovered from the neck of Connor Peterson at the time of autopsy, that was found tied in a bow around his neck with a very tight overhand knot remaining after the bow was loosened. Number 9 is a 15.5-inch length of duct tape recovered from Laci Peterson's pants at the time of autopsy. An excised portion of that tape was DNA tested in 2003 and shown to have human DNA present, but the quote DNA was not of an acceptable quality to generate a profile at that time. Number 10, duct tape from the Bay. Number 11, black tarp, discovered on Tuesday, April 15, 2003, by East Bay Regional Park District Police Department personnel along the Point Isabel shoreline, just a few hundred feet south of where Laci Peterson's body was recovered. This item has never been DNA tested. Number 12, black tarp, recovered from Point Isabel on May 11, 2003 by Gene Bonadillo, former Contra Costa County and Alameda County Sheriff's Deputy. Number 13, work glove or swabbed evidence collected from the work glove found in the master bedroom at 516 Covina as part of the MPD investigation into the burglary of the Medina's home on December 24th through 26th, 2002, which Susan Medina told police appeared to have been handled by the burglars who were inside the Medina home. Number 14, hammer or swabbed evidence collected from Hammer found in the master bedroom at 516 Covina as part of the MPD investigation into the burglary of the Medina's home on December 24 through 26, 2002, which Susan Medina told police appeared to have been handled by the burglars who were inside the Medina home. And that was the list. Now, while the LA Innocence Project requested to test those 14 items, the judge denied every single one of those except for one, and that is the 15.5-inch piece of duct tape found adhered to Laci's pants when her body was recovered from the bay. There were actually barnacles attached to the tape as well on the body and on the pants. Many people were perplexed at how and why the judge denied the van fire bloody mattress evidence, right? But she wrote at the time that she did not believe the van fire case was connected to the Peterson case. Now, back to the duct tape. The duct tape was actually first tested in 2003, and back then it did show that human DNA was present. However, at that time, it was not sufficient quality to generate a full DNA profile. So, of course, we know that 20 years later, technology and DNA testing has come a very long way. In an order filed on July 24th, 2024, Judge Elizabeth Hill outlined how the DNA testing on the piece of duct tape would be done. She ordered that Pure Gold Forensics, Inc. in California would conduct the DNA testing and list the mandatory chain of command and testing methods. And that at that point in July, within 45 days of that order, the DNA testing would be conducted, and the final results of that testing would be submitted to the judge under seal. So that means that sometime around the late summer, Judge Hill would have gotten that duct tape result. Now, here comes the crazy part. Just a few weeks after Judge Hill would have received those duct tape DNA results, she issued a new bombshell of an order. It does appear that she did change her mind a bit regarding some of her previous rulings. So the question many people have been asking is, did the duct tape DNA test results have anything to do with her changing her tune with some of those prior decisions? In a new filing dated October 7th, 2024, Judge Hill addressed more than 600 pieces of evidence that Mr. Peterson's defense team has requested access to. And she has granted, I believe, access to about 35 items of discovery. Now, I'm going to go over what those items are, which are largely surrounding the burglary. Most notably, however, the judge almost seemed to backtrack a little bit on her prior ruling about the van fire evidence not being a part of the Peterson case. So let's dig in to what she wrote. Now, essentially, for her decisions as a judge, she was required to apply the law of California Penal Code 1054.9, which provides that where a defendant makes a showing of unsuccessful good faith efforts to obtain discovery materials from trial counsel, the court shall order that the defendant be provided with reasonable access to materials in the possession of the prosecution and law enforcement authorities to which the same defendant would have been entitled to at the time of trial. The defense has to prove there's a reasonable basis that both the item exists and that the prosecution still possesses the materials. Now, here are the items which she is ordering the prosecution hand over. From Part A, the Medina Burglary. Audio and video recordings and any transcripts of the interviews MPD conducted with Stephen Todd and Donald Glenn Pierce at the Modesto Police Department on January 2, 2003, concerning an involvement in the Medina Burglary. The defense motion cites Bates material, including Officer Hicks's police report and a property record documenting that videotape recordings were made of the reference interviews. The prosecution concedes that the trial court allowed evidence of Todd's and Glenn's statements to be introduced at trial as evidence of the quality of the investigation by the Modesto Police Department. The defense has established a reasonable basis for believing this material exists, a reasonable basis for believing that the prosecution possessed the materials in the past, and also provides a reasonable basis to infer that the prosecution still possesses the materials. Number 7. handwritten notes taken by MPD officers who interviewed Stephen Todd and Glenn Pierce on January 2, 2003. While Todd and Pierce were seated in the back of a police patrol vehicle giving explicit details concerning their involvement in the Medina burglary the evening of January 2, 2003. Defense asserts the following basis for concluding these materials exist. The lengthy reports memorializing these interviews include very specific information that appears to have been transposed either from a recording or transcript or from contemporaneous notes taken from an officer or officers on the scene. Bates makes no reference contact with Donald Glenn Pierce. In relevant part, it describes a parole agent driving Officer Hicks and Stephen Todd from Tenya Drive to the Modesto Police Department, and statements made by Todd during that trip. Officer Hicks testified as a witness at trial. Any contemporaneous note he made would have been a statement of a witness discoverable. Defense has demonstrated that Mr. Peterson would have been entitled to this material at the time of trial. Part 17, MPD Police Investigation Reports, Arrest Reports, Notes, Recordings, and or other documents detailing Officer Mike Hicks' prior contacts with Donald Glenn Pierce and Stephen Todd, as indicated in Detective Stowe's and Detective Hicks' reports. Disc 4 to the discovery motion identifies Officer Hicks as part of the team that executed the searches at Tenya Drive related to the Medina burglary and indicates that he interviewed both Todd and Pierce because he had prior contacts and was, quote, familiar with them. At oral argument, the prosecution agreed that Officer Hicks testified at trial. The prosecution's written response also notes that Todd's and Pierce's statements were admitted for a non-hearsay purpose at trial. Investigation reports, arrest reports, notes, and recordings of Officer Hicks' prior contacts with Todd and Pierce would have been both statements of a trial witness and potential impeachment material of hearsay declarants. Now, this is 19A. The warrants issued and returns filed on the above described properties, including descriptions and photographs of all items of evidence found, including but not limited to stolen items recovered and identified as not the Medinas. Discovery available pursuant to Penal Code 1054.9 is restricted to materials currently in the possession of either the prosecution or law enforcement agencies which participated in the investigation of the case. Once a search warrant is executed, both the warrant and the corresponding warrant returned are filed with the court and become judicial record. When a search warrant is executed, the law requires the executing officers to both provide a receipt for any seized property, specifying in detail the property taken and maintain that seized property in law enforcement custody until the issuing court makes orders for its disposition. The defense motion and responsive prosecution exhibits demonstrate the Modesto Police Department did conduct searches of Tenya Drive addressed and did seize various items of property. Defense has demonstrated a reasonable basis to believe the descriptions and or photographs of the seized items exist. The seizure of stolen items of jewelry unrelated to the Medina burglary is potentially exculpatory because of the unaccounted jewelry in the Peterson investigation, and therefore falls with Steele categories 2 and 4. Part 19C, photographs of all locations searched and all items recovered, including the Medina's safe, jewelry, tools, and money wrappers. The defense motion and responsive prosecution exhibits demonstrate that the Modesto Police Department did conduct searches of Tenya Drive addresses and did seize various items of property. Defense has demonstrated a reasonable basis to believe the photographs taken during the search exist. Photographs of recovered property that were identified as belonging to the Medinas would not be potentially exculpatory for the reasons identified in item B above. The recovery of jewelry unrelated to the Medina burglary is potentially exculpatory because of the unaccounted jewelry in the Peterson investigation and therefore falls within Steele categories 2 and 4. The court orders production of any existing photographs of the location search where the jewelry not identified by the Medinas as their property was seized during the execution of search warrants at Tenya Drive addresses on January 2, 2003. Section 19D. Interviews or reports documenting whether the Medinas were shown any jewelry collected during the above-referenced searches that did not belong to them. Defense Exhibit 4. The declaration of Susan Medina includes a statement from Mrs. Medina that prior to the trial in this matter, that she was shown jewelry recovered by the police that did not belong to her. The recovery of jewelry unrelated to the Medina burglary during the search on January 2, 2003 is potentially exculpatory, given the unaccounted for jewelry in the Peterson investigation described in the defense pleadings and would have been discoverable at trial under Steele Category 2. Mrs. Medina's declaration provides a reasonable basis for concluding that such interviews occurred and that reports of those interviews exist. The court grants this request. Reports, notes, photographs, audio, video recordings, and transcripts thereof, results of forensic testing, and or other documents related to the gun and jewelry anonymously dropped off at the Modesto Police Department on January 2, 2003, including but not limited to a digital copy of videotape surveillance from the Modesto Police Department lobby taken at approximately 1:10 a.m. on January 3, 2003, depicting a white male adult, late 20s to 30s, 5 foot 8 inches tall, approximately 150 pounds, carrying a blue plastic shopping bag and telling the officer in the call box he wanted to turn in some stolen property, which was later determined to be jewelry and a gun from the Medina burglary. At oral argument, the prosecution acknowledged that this item had been originally provided to the defense, but objected to reproduction because the defense failed to demonstrate that it currently exists in law enforcement possession. The prior production puts this material squarely into Steele Category 1, file reconstruction. Reasonable basis for believing the prosecution possessed the materials in the past also provides a reasonable basis to infer that the prosecution still possesses the materials. No additional showing on that point is necessary. The court grants this request. 20D. Photographs of the recovered property taken by CSO Hodson. At oral argument, the prosecution acknowledged that this item had been originally provided to the defense, but objected to reproduction because the defense failed to demonstrate that it currently exists in law enforcement possession. The prior production puts this material into Steele Category 1, file reconstruction. A reasonable basis for believing that the prosecution possesses the materials in the past also provides a reasonable basis to infer the prosecution still possesses the materials. Fingerprint examination reports by evidence ID technicians Doug Lovell and Joyce Smith and or any DNA, biological or forensic evidence collected from the Medina residence and or their recovered property. The presence of unidentified impressions not belonging to Stephen Todd or Donald Pierce is potentially exculpatory material in that it might suggest additional participants in the burglary consistent with the defense's theory of third-party culpability. Interesting. Now, 23 says laboratory request forms or other correspondence requesting any forensic testing on any evidence collected in relation to the Medina burglary. For reasons articulated in item E above, the court orders disclosure of any laboratory request forms or correspondence related to fingerprint impressions evidence collected from the Medina residence and denies the balance of request for failure to demonstrate a reasonable basis that materials other than the fingerprint collection and comparison exist. Now, that was all of the burglary evidence that the judge has granted. Now for Part B. Lieutenant Xavier Aponte reports. She is granting number 7. All communications and correspondence between the Modesto Police Department and Lieutenant Aponte of CRC Norco, including but not limited to A, the actual facts, including any cover sheet and any other information Detective Grogan communicated to Lieutenant Aponte when he faxed him a copy of the tip sheet in 2005, as referenced in Detective Grogan's March 9, 2005 affidavit. Lieutenant Aponte's declaration was submitted to the trial court in opposition to the defense's motion for a new trial. Detective Grogan's affidavit was also submitted to the trial court in connection with that motion. The facts Detective Grogan sent is a witness statement pursuant to Penal Code 1054.1 and therefore within Steel Category 2. The court grants this request. 7B. Lieutenant Aponte's actual response to Detective Grogan's 2005 facts referenced in 1, whether by email, voicemail, fax, or any other means as indicated in Lieutenant Aponte's March 3, 2005 declaration. Aponte's declaration was submitted to the trial court in opposition to the defense's motion for a new trial. Detective Grogan's affidavit was also submitted to the trial court in connection with that motion. Any written or oral response made by Lieutenant Aponte to Detective Grogan is a witness statement pursuant to Penal Code 1054.1 and therefore within Category 2. The court grants this request. Now, that is all she's going to grant with the Lieutenant Aponte section. Now for Part C, the Croton Watch. She wrote, the following summary of the facts surrounding the Croton Watch is taken from the parties' pleadings and court review of the relevant interviews described by the reference Bates numbers, which were provided in the prosecution's Lodge Exhibit, Disc D. Scott Peterson told Detective Grogan that he believed Laci was wearing a diamond-encrusted watch on December 24, 2002, before she disappeared. When asked about the kind of metal on the watch she was wearing, Peterson said, quote, I don't know, she had a couple of them. I think she had a silver one and a gold one. A couple of gold ones. When asked, quote, the one she had on, it would be a gold one probably. The metal? Peterson, yeah, probably. Better chance than anything else. Laci's Croton watch was not located in the Petersons' home. The Modesto Police Department attempted to investigate whether the Croton watch was pawned. Relevant to defendant's request, Detective Grogan directed a Modesto Community Service officer to search pawn records for the word Croton. In March 2003, the officer located one pawn record indicating that a woman had pawned a Croton watch on December 31, 2002. According to the defense, the pawn shop where this pawn occurred was less than 3 miles from the Petersons' home, and that would have been literally days after Laci went missing. According to the defense, the pawn shop where this pawn occurred was less than 3 miles from the Peterson home, and again, it was less than a week after Laci went missing that this was pawned less than 3 miles from the home. Mr. Peterson's trial counsel introduced the pawn slip from his pawn as evidence at trial on June 17, 2004 as Defense Exhibit N. At that point, Stanislaus County District Attorney's Office investigator Lieutenant Mark Smith determined that Deanna R., the woman who pawned the watch, was living in Oklahoma. Lieutenant Smith interviewed Miss Renfro's mother in order to locate Miss Renfro. Miss Renfro's mother stated that Miss Renfro lived with her in December of 2002 and January 2003. Although Miss Renfro's mother told Lieutenant Smith that Miss Renfro had a history of stealing jewelry from her and other family members, when shown a photograph of Laci Peterson's watch, Miss Renfro's mother stated she had never seen it before. Lieutenant Smith arranged for an Oklahoma District Attorney's Office investigator, Mark Saunders, to interview Miss Renfro and her boyfriend, James Brayer. Saunders interviewed each separately in July of 2004. Those interviews were recorded, and defense counsel Pat Harris signed a discovery receipt for them on September 15, 2004. Miss Renfro stated she pawned the watch twice. First on December 31, 2002. The watch was a gift from Brayer. Brayer said that he purchased the watch used before giving it to Renfro. Renfro said she got the watch in mid-November of 2002. Brayer said that he bought the watch the week before Valentine's Day in 2002 from a girl named Jenny, who said she got it from her mother. Jenny offered to either sell it to him or trade it for pot. Brayer paid Jenny $25 and a quarter ounce of marijuana for the watch. Brayer said that when he bought the watch from Jenny, there was a male friend named Stephen with her, who was described in his late 20s, shorter than 5'9" and bald. And it says, parentheses here, Stephen Todd is described in materials attached to defense's DNA reply brief at page 165 as having been 6 foot tall and age 31 as of March 31st, 1999, which meant he would have been at least 34 in August to November of 2002. I guess maybe they're thinking that this was Stephen Todd, who was with this Jenny person. Stephen drove a white primer-colored 280Z. Breuer said he gave Renfro the watch for Valentine's Day, but only knew of one pawn. He asked her about it when he noticed she didn't wear it. She first told him she lost it. Then she told him she pawned it and used the money to get drunk with Anthony Scarlatta. Investigator had a picture of Laci's Croton watch from a video of it that she had taken when attempting to sell it on eBay prior to her murder. Both Breuer and Renfro were separately shown the photo of Laci's watch. Breuer stated it was not the watch he gave Renfro. Breuer said the watch he gave Renfro had a rectangular face. Laci's watch had a round face. He also pointed out other differences about the size and shape of the band and the shape of the links of the band. Renfro stated that Laci's pictured watch was not the watch that she pawned. She redeemed the first pawn at some point and then pawned the same watch a second time on Valentine's Day of 2003 under the name of a man who accompanied her to the pawn shop that day, Anthony Scarlatta. She stated that she had been visited by detectives in late February or early March 2003 and interviewed because they were investigating whether the watch that she pawned belonged to Laci Peterson. In her interview with Saunders, Renfro stated that she thought those investigators were private investigators working for Scott Peterson. Because of the visit from detectives, she never redeemed the second pawn. She gave the detective who interviewed her the pawn slip from the second pawn. Breuer said that he and Renfro were first contacted by a private investigator who provided a business card, but whose name he could not recall. He gave the second pawn slip to that investigator, who did not make a written or tape-recorded statement. After that investigator came to his residence inquiring about the watch, 2 police detectives showed up to ask about it. Lieutenant Mark Smith of the Stanislaus County District Attorney's Office contacted the Modesto Police Department to try and identify who those interviewers were. Lieutenant Mike Czar told Lieutenant Smith that he was unable to find any evidence of that interview. Breuer was re-interviewed by Saunders to get a description of the police interview. He recalled that they carried guns, drove an unmarked dark blue vehicle, and wore, quote, star-shaped badges on their belts. They were white men between 35 and 50 years old, between 5'9" and 6 foot tall. Lieutenant Smith's report indicated that the Modesto Police Department badges are shaped like shields, not stars. Breuer's second interview with Saunders, he corrected the timing of his purchase of the watch from Jenny. He said that he now recalled that he bought it between August 2002 and Thanksgiving of 2002, and that he had confused the date in the first interview because he knew Renfro pawned it on Valentine's Day. Lieutenant Smith contacted Sam Newman, an employee of the pawn shop. Deanna pawned the watch both times. Newman examined the pawn slip the defense introduced at trial, which described the watch as a 14-karat yellow gold quartz watch with scratches used. Newman stated that the pawn shop has a diamond detection device that employees are required to use and note if an item of pawn jewelry contains diamonds on the pawn slip. Laci's watch had diamonds around the face. Newman was shown a picture of Laci's watch and stated that if that watch had been pawned, the appraiser for the shop would have prepared a report on it because it was obviously expensive. That did not occur. After that interview where Renfro disclosed that she had pawned the watch a second time under a different name, Lieutenant Smith recontacted Newman. Newman located the second pawn slip under the name described by Renfro, which matched the date that Renfro said the watch was pawned. The watch was never redeemed and would have been placed in a cabinet for public sale in June 2003. The pawn shop had no way to track who purchased it. Newman checked his display at the time of the interview on July 6, 2004, and the watch was not there. The second slip described the watch as a 14-karat yellow gold watch used and worn, with no brand mentioned and no description of diamonds. Newman told Lieutenant Smith that there was, quote, no chance that the watch pawned was Laci's Croton Watch, depicted in the eBay photo he was shown. He said that once the watch was not redeemed and available for sale, he would have had it examined by his jeweler and would have known if it had real diamonds. He told Lieutenant Smith that he checked with his jeweler and the jeweler did not remember any lady's watch with diamonds around the face coming through the store. Defense asserts that the prosecution never disclosed any law enforcement interview with Renfro from 2003 and failed to turn over the second pawn slip prior to trial. The prosecution's exhibits demonstrate that the second pawn slip was disclosed to trial defense counsel Pat Harris, who signed for it on September 15, 2004. The declaration of defense investigator Carl Jensen, attached to the defense's DNA motion reply, summarizes both law enforcement and Jensen's contact with James Romano. Romano told Jensen that he was in jail watching TV and saw a court TV report about the pawn of a watch that may have been Laci's. Upon seeing the story, he recalled that in mid-February 2003, a friend named Deanna Harbid Renfro and her friend Anthony Scarlatta asked him if he wanted to buy a watch. He described the watch that they had shown him as medium-sized with a lot of diamonds. Jensen describes listening to the audio-recorded law enforcement interview of Romano, who told law enforcement that the watch was heavily faced with 1-carat diamonds, with a medium round or oval face, not petite. Romano didn't buy the watch and believed that Renfro and Scarlatta then sold it at a pawn shop. Jensen states that he interviewed Romano in custody at the Stanislaus County Jail on October 23, 2004, and further states that the fact that Anthony Scarlatta had pawned the watch on Valentine's Day was not known to the defense and was not publicly known prior to Romano calling to provide police with the information he had. Jensen's declaration further describes interviewing Scarlatta on October 23, 2004. Scarlatta described being with Miss Renfro on Valentine's Day, 2003, pawning the watch, and Renfro getting into a fight with Breuer after pawning the watch. Scarlatta gave the pawn slip back to Renfro. Scarlatta described the watch as, quote, gold or silver. Jensen showed him a picture of Laci's Croton watch, and he stated that he could not say for certain whether it was or was not the watch that Renfro pawned. He told Jensen that no police ever interviewed him about the watch. In addition to the information about the watch, Romano provided other information to both law enforcement and Jensen about overhearing a group of men in the garage of a Modesto residence in February of 2003 discussing Laci having interrupted the Medina burglary. Jensen's declaration discusses various steps that Romano took beginning July of 2004 to contact law enforcement with this information. In the Jensen declaration, the first mention by Romano of the watch incident with Renfro occurred on October 15, 2004, to a deputy, Terry Johnson. At that point, contrary to Jensen's declaration, the defense had been in possession of the Scarlatta pawn slip, the interviews of Renfro and Breuer, and the police investigation reports of those interviews for a month. There is no further information in the defense pleading to document when the Valentine's Day pawn became, quote, publicly known or reported. In the prosecution's opposition to the discovery motion Disc 4 exhibits, a report documents that Modesto Police Detective Handy spoke to Romano on October 18, 2004, 3 days after the tip to Deputy Johnson and 6 days before Jensen's interview. Handy's report began by stating that police clerk Lisa McClowan told Hendy that Deputy Johnson was contacted by Romano. This was the reason Hendy was asked to interview Romano. In addition to the information Romano later conveyed to Jensen, Romano told Hendy he was about to be transferred to state prison to serve a sentence on drug charges. While he began the interview by stating he did not want any consideration, at the end of the interview he asked Hendy to contact his parole officer to recommend that he be allowed to get into truck driving school. Romano also described having been in the hospital on December 25, 2002 for appendicitis, which resulted in emergency surgery. He was also in the hospital recovering for 2 weeks. He described his memory after the surgery as, quote, somewhat clouded for an undetermined period of time. Later, he told Hendy that he was a long-time drug user and his memory was, quote, sketchy throughout the phase of his life when he obtained the information he was giving about the Peterson case. Now, the LAIP was requesting a bunch of evidence surrounding the watch, and this is what she's granted. Number 8, all notes, reports, correspondence, photos, audio and video recordings, and written transcripts thereof, or other documents related to the information James Romano provided to the Modesto Police Department in 2004 regarding the abduction of Laci Peterson, including but not limited to all statements made by James Romano to law enforcement officers and or correctional facility staff regarding information he had relating to the Laci Peterson investigation, including but not limited to his statement made to number 2 Stanislaus County Sheriff Deputy Terry Johnson. Detective Hendy's report does state that Romano spoke directly to Deputy Terry Johnson, as does McCohen's statement to Detective Hendy. The defense has demonstrated a reasonable basis for believing that this material exists. If true, the information that Romano provided regarding overhearing discussion of Laci confronting the Medina burglars is potentially exculpatory. Defense would have been entitled to it at trial pursuant to Penal Code 1054.1 and is now entitled to it as Steel Category 2 material. Number 3, Modesto Police Department Detective Hendy. Detective Hendy spoke directly to Romano and recorded the interview. Additionally, Detective Hendy was a trial witness. Defense counsel and oral argument acknowledged that defense is in possession of Hendy's report, but indicated that some of the audio tapes in the defense's file were blank. Counsel was unable to specify which tapes were blank. The defense has established a reasonable basis to believe that the tape exists. It was provided at the time of trial and therefore falls into Steel Category 1 to the extent that a usable copy is no longer in defense possession, and Steel Category 2 as a statement of a trial witness. The court grants this request in part. The prosecution is ordered to provide a replacement copy of the recordings of Detective Hendy's interviews with Romano. Number 4, Sheriff Sergeant Campbell. Detective Hendy's report states that Romano had direct contact with Sergeant Campbell. For the same reason identified in item 2 above related to Deputy Johnson, the court grants this request. Number 5, Deputy Safford. Detective Hendy's report states that Romano had direct contact with Deputy Safford. Additionally, Investigator Jensen's report establishes that Deputy Safford called the MPD tip line as a result of his contact with Romano. For the same reasons identified in item 2 above related to Deputy Johnson, the court grants this request. Number 6, Deputy Johnson. This request is a duplicate of item 2 above. The court makes the same ruling. Number 7, Section 12. All internal correspondence by and between law enforcement officers and or correctional facility staff regarding the information James Romano provided, including but not limited to Part D, Detective Dodge Hendy's conversation with Detective George Stowe regarding his investigation into the Medina burglary. Detective Hendy testified at trial. His statements to Detective Stowe would be statements of a trial witness discoverable and fall into Steel Category 2. His report documents that the referenced conversation occurred. Defense has demonstrated a reasonable basis for believing this material exists. The request is granted. Now, that's basically it from the Croton Watch section. Now for D. December 25th, 2002, van fire in Airport District. She's requesting a complete copy of Modesto Police Department case number 02-142687 and Modesto Fire Department case number SMF 02-01942 concerning the investigation of an incendiary fire of an orange van containing a mattress with apparent bloodstains located in the alley between 612 Thrasher and 607 Empire, less than 1 mile from the Petersons' home in the early morning of December 25th, 2002, the day after Laci Peterson was reported missing. The items requested included, but are not limited to, the following. Now, remember, this is the one where she, months ago, ruled, that she didn't think there was evidence that the van fire had anything to do with the Peterson case. So this is a little bit of a change. She wrote, the prosecution's duty of disclosure is broader than its due process duty under Brady. Materiality is relevant in considering a claimed discovery violation after trial has occurred, but does not govern the scope of the duty to disclose it in the first place, which encompasses all exculpatory evidence. And she references People versus DeLeos in 2022. Exculpatory evidence is that which, quote, casts doubt on the defendant's guilt, and impeaching evidence that calls into question the credibility of government witnesses. It in turn requires the court to evaluate the defense entitlement to the material at the time of trial. The orange van evidence was not, quote, impeaching material that called into question the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses. It would fall within Penal Code Section 1054.1, a requirement to turn over any exculpatory evidence only if it's casting doubt on the defendant's guilt. Additionally, Penal Code Section 1054.1 requires the prosecution's agency to turn over, quote, all relevant real evidence seized or obtained as part of the investigation of the offenses charged, that is either in the possession of the prosecuting agency or known by the prosecution to be in the possession of the investigating agencies. Relevant means having any tendency in reason to prove or disprove a disputed fact that is of consequence to the determination of the action. Brian Spitolsky's declaration states that upon his initial response to the scene of the orange van fire, he was unaware of the missing persons investigation regarding Laci Peterson. Later in the same declaration, Spitolsky states that when he became aware of the Peterson investigation and the reported potential connection to a van, he contacted Modesto Police Department Detective Shipley. Spitolsky accompanied Detective Shipley, who was investigating the Peterson case, to the premises of the registered owner of the van. He further documents that a search of the van was conducted on December 31st, 2002. The prosecution's opposition states on page 193 that the stolen, burned orange van was cross-referenced to the Peterson case. The court does not view the orange van evidence as casting doubt on Peterson's guilt because no witness or forensic evidence obtained ever established that Laci Peterson was in the orange van. However, it is apparent, based on the involvement of Detective Shipley and the cross-referencing of the investigation of the two cases, that the orange van was, quote, part of the investigation of the offenses charged. The prosecution was therefore required by Penal Code 1054.1 to turn over, quote, relevant real evidence seized or obtained to the defense. Relevance, as defined by Penal Code 210, is a low bar. It requires only a tendency in a reason to disprove a disputed fact. Even if not exculpatory, the defense at trial would have been entitled to this material under Penal Code 1054.1 had it been requested. It is therefore discoverable under Penal Code 1054.9 under Steal Categories 2 and 4. So she completely changed her tune there. Number 2, a complete color copy of the Department of Justice Central Valley Crime Laboratory file, including but not limited to all bench notes, diagrams, DNA reports, including electronic data, gas chromatographs, photos, lab request forms, all documents requiring the examination and forensic testing of all items of evidence collected from the van, including but not limited to the mattress cutting, the rag collected from the fuel tank, any fingerprints and or palm prints lifted from the scene. This request is granted for the same reasons identified in the general heading of Category D. Number 4, all documents related to the collection of fingerprints, palm prints, and latent prints from the van as requested in the incident history report and any subsequent examination, analysis, or comparisons of that print evidence. Number 5, a complete color copy of Modesto Fire Department Fire Investigator Brian Spitolsky's entire investigation file in Modesto Fire Department case number SMF 02019-142. This request is granted for the same reasons identified in the general heading of Category D. In addition, the discovery receipts opposition on Disc 4 show that at least some of this material was turned over pre-trial and signed for by defense investigator William Pavlik on May 2, 2003. Number 6, color copies of all photographs and scene diagrams created of the orange van, the scene where it was located, and any or all evidence collected therefrom, included but not limited to A, full-size colored copies of the black and white thumbnails, B, all scene diagrams created by fire investigator Brian Spitolsky and or any other investigator. Part C, color copies of all photographs of the orange van and its contents, including the stained mattress, concrete cinder blocks, metal cans, and other items located inside the van taken at the tow yard and MPD evidence locker during the examinations and collection of evidence from the van. Photographs depicting the cutting and sampling of the mattress fabric at the, quote, covered secure area. And number 10, the initial reports that MPD evidence ID tech levels supplemental report. Number 13, all MPD and MFD reports, notes, photos, audio, video recordings, and transcripts thereof, documenting and or memorializing all investigatory actions taken regarding the theft of the orange van prior to the burning, including but not limited to interviews with all witnesses, including but not limited to G, all documents, audio and video recordings, inventory of evidence collected related to MPD's search of Robert S.'s residence located on River Road on December 31st, 2002, or any other date, in connection with the investigation into the disappearance of Laci Peterson, the Medina burglary, and or the intentionally set van fire referenced above the morning of December 25th, 2002, including but not limited to miscellaneous tools, safe, and additional items found in Robert S.'s possession on December 31st, 2002. Detective Shipley's report indicates that the reference search was conducted. The material would have been discoverable either under Steele categories 2 or 4. The request is granted. Okay, that was all the van fire evidence in Section D. Let's move on to Section E. Reports of post-December 24th Laci Peterson sightings. And this one says Section B, all reports reflecting any interviews by Detective Reed or any other officer with Colleen F., who reported to MPD on December 30th, 2002, that on December 24th, between 10 and 10:30 a.m., she was backing out of her driveway when she saw someone that looked like Laci. The tip sheet states that the caller saw someone that looked like Laci, but went on to describe that person as heavy-set, walking a very large dog, wearing a white jacket with a brownish crim. The dog she saw seemed much bigger than the picture of the dog she saw in the press. She was uncertain if the woman she saw was pregnant. A handwritten note on the tip sheet says that it was given to Detective Reed. The defense has demonstrated a reasonable basis for believing that the material exists. Information that casts doubt on the prosecution's trial timeline, if believed, could be potentially exculpatory and material within the meaning of Brady and falls within Steele Category 2. The court grants this request. And that was it for that section. But now for Section G, just about missing bait pages. And she said she did grant several of these, which are mostly related to just what they call prosecution disc 4 in this section. On to Section H, which is regarding the Gene Ralston Bay search data. Now, Judge Hill is granting any photos or video footage obtained when Ralston suggested, quote, the video camera used to tape the monitor output that members of the search team viewed of the ROV aboard the boat. Gene Ralston's report at Bates 26854 states in summary that while attempting to image underwater objects that he believed resembled human remains, the video image was, quote, insufficient to determine for absolute certainty that the object was in fact a human body. To attempt to resolve the uncertainty, the searchers attempted to rig a video camera to record the image, which did not work. Ralston then suggested using the video camera to record the monitor output directly. Ralston stated that the attempt was only partially successful due to the monitor scan rate being out of sync with the camera. The prosecution first asserts that this material does not exist because Ralston said the attempt to video did not work. More precisely, Ralston said the attempt was, quote, not successful, but he did not say that no physical recording of the unsuccessful attempt was generated. The prosecution next argues that any resulting video is not in any steal category. The court disagrees. The recording made on the video camera, successful or otherwise, is, quote, relevant, real evidence seized or obtained as part of the investigation of the offenses charged, pursuant to Penal Code 1054.1. The prosecution was therefore obligated to disclose it at the time of trial. This request is granted. Okay, so that's it for that section. Now for section I, all other base search data, and section J, computer forensics. The judge denied all of those requests. Same with section K for the scent dogs. All of it was denied. Now for section L, the Modesto Police and Stanislaus County DA policy. This was the one, for those who recall, it was implied by several sources that one of the lead detectives for the Peterson case was having an affair with the prosecutor, Birget Fladager, during the trial, which would be a huge no-no, obviously. So the LA Innocence Project was seeking essentially their staff policy information. The judge denied it, writing, defense asserts as a basis for disclosure of this material the declaration of George Michael Gudgel, which says that while staying at the hotel utilized by the prosecution team during the trial in hopes of establishing a relationship with them, he observed, quote, progressively familiar interactions between trial prosecutor Fladager and Modesto Police Detective Grogan. He further states that, quote, he was told by colleagues that there were rumors of a romantic relationship, that he heard other detectives speculating about why Grogan continued to stay at the hotel, and that he, quote, later confirmed with an unidentified source, quote, who had personal knowledge that an extramarital affair had occurred. The declaration does not specify when Gudgel interviewed the unidentified source, the basis for the asserted personal knowledge, or when that source indicated the affair allegedly occurred pre-trial, during trial, or post-trial. The court finds the above-described speculation, innuendo, and anonymous hearsay inadequate as a basis for establishing that any of the materials sought in this subpart fit any of the required steal categories. All requests in Part L are denied. So I guess we won't be continuing that any further, that drama. Now for Part M, post-conviction reports, evidence, and tips. All requests here also denied. Part N, interviews and surveillance of defendant. They're looking for all audio and video recordings of MPD's interviews with Mr. Peterson beginning December 24, 2002 through April 30th, 2003, including but not limited to, this is what she is granting, interviews with MPD officers, including Detective Craig Grogan, conducted with Mr. Peterson on December 25, 2002, while Mr. Peterson was at the MPD, located in various rooms, including interview rooms. This request includes all recordings of the pre-polygraph interview Doug Mansfield conducted or attempted to conduct on that date. The record in this matter demonstrates that Mr. Peterson was interviewed on December 25, 2002, and that various rooms in the MPD are equipped with recording devices. It further demonstrates that law enforcement during the course of the investigation made special efforts to record statements made by Mr. Peterson. The defense has articulated with a reasonable basis for believing this material exists and has offered a sufficiently narrow and specific time frame for this request for the prosecution to identify and produce any recordings. The court grants this request. Part E. Interviews MPD officers, including Detective Grogan, conducted with Mr. Peterson on January 3, 2003. While he was in various rooms at MPD, the record in this matter demonstrates that Mr. Peterson was interviewed on January 3, 2003, and that various rooms in MPD are equipped with recording devices. F. Interviews MPD officers, including Detective Grogan, conducted with Mr. Peterson on January 3rd while he was being transported to and from a facility to provide biological samples and while he was being searched, fingerprinted, and photographed pursuant to a search warrant. The record on this matter demonstrates that Mr. Peterson was interviewed on January 3, 2003, and it further demonstrates that law enforcement during the course of the investigation made special efforts to record statements made by Mr. Peterson. The prosecution even made oral argument that particular recordings of Mr. Peterson existed because officers placed recording devices in the car as a means of distinguishing why there was no reasonable basis to believe that recordings of other witnesses during police transport existed. The defense has articulated a reasonable basis for believing the material exists and has offered a sufficiently narrow and specific time frame for this request for the prosecution to identify and produce any recordings. Now on to Section O, the Tracey tip. All subsections of this were denied. So, all of that said, that is what Judge Hill has granted. But a lot of questions remain. Will the prosecution say they can't locate any of this evidence? It's possible. I mean, they've done that for the past 20 years. But the fact is that the judge granting access to this evidence is now opening the door for the LA Innocence Project to begin the discovery process of a new trial for Scott Peterson. I mean, that's what this is. This process is allowing the LA Innocence Project to poke holes in the argument of the state for a potential new trial, should one be granted. Now, I'm going to give you my opinion on all this. I honestly think this order is huge for Scott Peterson's defense. And now they have a judge who is looking at this burglary and van fire evidence, agreeing that legally speaking, they were and are entitled to this evidence, which could ultimately bring them a new trial. Now, it remains to be seen whether he will be granted a new trial, but as it stands now, it's looking good for Peterson and his team, probably the best it's looked for him in 20 years. And it's also important to note that, generally speaking, in the appeal process, so many cases don't even get heard. They get thrown out and don't get a hearing unless enough basis is shown. So the fact that he has had multiple hearings that are now leading to the judge granting requests for more evidence, it really does show that the judge agrees that there may have been some shady things that were going on in Modesto and Stanislaus County as far as misconduct goes. I also think that, frankly, it's very bizarre to hear that multiple witnesses have said they fear police retaliation if they speak on the case now, 20 years after the fact. Doesn't anyone else find that rather alarming? I mean, ask yourself. Isn't it a huge red flag when citizens say they are afraid of their local police department? For me, the biggest question about the Peterson case, which has now been acknowledged by the judge, is did the state withhold the van fire evidence on purpose or was it an oversight? I mean, Brady rule says it doesn't matter either way, it is misconduct. Now, did the state omit the evidence on purpose because they didn't want the jury to have any doubt about Peterson's guilt because they were so frustrated they couldn't find a shred of forensic evidence, but they just knew he did it, so they withheld it? Or did they withhold this evidence for some other reason relating to police corruption? Either way, it is now becoming a huge problem as it is illegal for them to have done that. And either way, the fact that this happened in such a high-profile case with the whole world and media watching, that should scare the living crap out of literally everybody in this country. Because what's happening in other cases where not as many people are watching? We know from history that these types of cover-ups can and do happen. Does it mean that Scott Peterson is innocent? No, it doesn't. But for me, it sure does prove the state blew this case. Here's the thing, too. I know a thing or two about Birget Fladager, who was the DA for Stanislaus County during the Peterson trial. And to be clear, she has a history of being accused of prosecutorial misconduct, specifically of withholding and even fabricating evidence in other cases. In fact, Fladager literally has multiple federal pending lawsuits for prosecutorial misconduct in the Frank Carson case from 2016. Now, who was Frank Carson? There are several amazing podcasts and documentaries about this incredible case if you'd like to dig deeper. The podcast is called The Trials of Frank Carson, and there's an episode of a series called True Crime Story, It Couldn't Happen Here. And that's from season 1, episode 12. But Frank Carson was a brazen Modesto criminal defense lawyer known for trying to uncover corruption. And he was not well liked by the DA or really anyone at the DA's office. They lost cases against him often, and he was allegedly ruthless towards the DA staff, and he often even accused the Modesto Police Department of corruption. Well, in 2015, they charged Carson, his wife, and his stepdaughter of murder. They literally threw his entire family in jail. The preliminary hearing lasted 18 months, and the trial was 17 months long, which is the second longest murder trial in the history of California courts. The case involved the murder of Corey Kaufman, a scrap metal thief, and the conspiracy of Carson and his family to cover it up. The prosecution's theory was that Carson masterminded the killing as revenge for an attempted theft from his junkyard. The prosecution called more than 100 witnesses and kept bringing in loads of undisclosed evidence during the trial, which is a big no-no. They would just keep bringing it in and dumping huge files of new evidence in during both the preliminary hearings and the trial, which was obviously burying the defense because these things are really due at the beginning, so they're not having to have simultaneous investigations while they're trying to have trial hearings, which interestingly is exactly how Scott Peterson's lawyer, Mark Garagos, has described how the Peterson trial went. He says the prosecution was habitually dropping loads of files mid-trial, and they had to keep suspending the trial in order to keep doing their own simultaneous investigations. Now, with the Carson case, during the preliminary hearing, when the prosecution kept pulling this garbage, the judge slammed the DA's office, calling the mistakes, quote, totally unacceptable, as she was astounded at the number of, quote, errors. Now, one day during the preliminary hearings, while the media was present, the judge angrily asked, "How does this happen?" 3 times within a minute. The judge also went on to say she had, quote, never seen a district attorney's office make so many mistakes with respect to discovery, end quote. The judge went on to say she would impose sanctions on the district attorney's office for that performance. Now, Carson was ultimately acquitted, but after the massive stress over the ordeal and living in prison for, 2 years, his health faded and he passed away. His wife was also initially accused of murder, but was later cleared. Now, she is who has filed lawsuits against the state, claiming she and her daughter were wrongfully prosecuted and that the state both fabricated and withheld evidence during trial. Now, the prosecution tried to get those lawsuits thrown out, but in September of 2023, just about a year ago, a judge determined the trio of lawsuits would proceed. Now, here's the kicker about the whole thing. In 2014, Frank Carson ran against Birget Fladager for district attorney. And about 1 year later, that is when him and his entire family got locked up for murder. Interesting. Coincidence? I don't know. Also in Fladager's background is that she admitted to reducing a prosecutor's suspension for driving under the influence from 45 days to 10 days and said that the public was unlikely to ever find out about the change in discipline. Then in 2018, Fladager faced controversy again when she said she did not want senior attorneys to tell rookie attorneys that the defendants that they were prosecuting were innocent, even when it were true. In 2021, Fladager announced that she would not be running for re-election, but plans to come out of retirement to keep working as prosecutor on the Peterson case. In 2021, Fladager said about the Peterson case, quote, "Our goal is to bring the habeas petition to a successful conclusion as soon as possible. If, however, the court proceedings continue beyond my last day in office in January of 2023, I intend to make myself fully available to assist in ongoing litigation for the next elected district attorney, if the next elected district attorney will allow me to do so. I have already discussed this with Laci's family." Fladager added that she would take on one of several roles in the Peterson case when her term ended, including as a deputy district attorney or even as a private lawyer. She said, quote, "It would just depend on the circumstances." So fast forward to today, we see that Birget Fladager did maintain her promise to Laci's family, and she continues to fight against Peterson's lawyers in court. It is believed by many she is getting paid a special rate to come out of retirement to fight against the LA Innocence Project in court, even though many times during appeal, it is generally considered best practice for a different prosecutor to handle an appeal of a case they initially handled. Which makes me wonder, if Birget Fladager really cared so much about Laci's family, why would she have risked allowing Peterson the chance to get his conviction overturned by either purposefully or accidentally withholding so much exculpatory evidence in the first place? Because no matter whether you think Peterson is guilty or innocent, if you believe in the United States Constitution, you have to admit that the state ruined this case. The fact that they dropped the ball here in more ways than one should really infuriate and offend anybody who cares about justice. And do you know who should be most angry and insulted? I mean, Scott, should be if he's truly innocent. But honestly, mostly Sharon Rocha and Laci Peterson and Connor themselves, because their case should have been handled with more care from the state. Because even if Scott is 100% guilty of the murder of Laci and Connor, a judge has just pointed out that the state has risked letting this man walk free if this withheld discovery was ever discovered. Now, here's the thing. I think that people who think that this is just all information the Peterson family has fabricated, are really in for a rude awakening here. This type of thing does not get this far unless there are really strong arguments and proof to back up the argument. So even just going back to the whole idea that the LA Innocence Project is just some random group of hack lawyers trying to make a name for themselves, that is clearly not what is happening here. Plus, the idea of a team of professional lawyers risking their careers and reputation by trying to make a name for themselves by defending one of the most hated men in America that everyone seems to think is clearly 100% guilty doesn't really make any sense. That is because one of the things about the Peterson case that you quickly come to realize if you ever voice any doubt about Peterson's guilt is that you will quickly see that a lot of hate will be thrown in your direction. The truth is that most of the public has a very strong and very negative opinion of Scott Peterson. Therefore, it would be highly irresponsible and illogical for a nonprofit to take on his case merely to make a name for themselves if such bad press is now surrounding their practice and they are being called, quote, clueless or irresponsible just for picking up the case and doing their job. All you have to do is go look at their Google reviews to see what I'm talking about. Look at this. And speaking of the public vitriol and pressure, I just want to point out that the fear of that type of pressure and corruption is exactly what leads to injustice in the first place. Those who know a lot about the Peterson case may recall that a juror named Justin Falconer got removed from the jury early on in the trial after speaking to Laci's brother before trial one day. After Justin was dismissed from the jury, he went on the news and gave an interview and said that if he was going into deliberations that day with everything he'd heard, he would have to vote not guilty because, quote, the prosecution hasn't given us any reason to believe otherwise so far. Yeah, he lied about a couple of things that we saw in there, but I haven't seen anything to make me believe that he committed this crime, end quote. Now, after he made that statement on the news, he got a lot of hate thrown his way. In fact, he received so many death threats for voicing his opinion of reasonable doubt that he had to move from California to Kansas. That's not even to mention the actual jury foreman named Gregory Jackson, who literally went to the judge to ask to be removed during deliberations because he felt he was being threatened for suggesting there wasn't enough evidence to convict Scott Peterson. Guys, this is not the way justice is supposed to be. Honestly, I just went to Salem, Massachusetts over summer vacation, and this literally sounds like witch trial type stuff. And it takes very brave people to speak up against this fear and bullying surrounding this case. And speaking of brave, I just want to mention really quickly something else. In the world of justice, you have corruption by people interested in preserving their own interests, and then you also have balanced, justice-minded people. I just wanted to note at the beginning of these hearings on March 12th that Judge Hill noted that she did receive an email from someone she described as, quote, some kind of spectator, end quote, where she read the beginning of this email and then stopped when she realized what she was reading. I mean, just imagine the type of pressure a judge feels. She has her own reputation at stake here. And when I researched Judge Hill, I couldn't find anything negative in her background, but what I did notice is that she served as a deputy district attorney in San Mateo County for 10 years, specifically holding specialty assignments in domestic violence prosecution. And further, this judge was also a member of the Board of Directors of Community Overcoming Relationship Abuse from 2005 to 2010. So in my opinion, for this judge to rule the way that she has by agreeing with the LA Innocence Project that the prosecution should have handed many of these items over 20 years ago, it appears that she is looking at this evidence pretty fairly, which I'm finding very admirable if there is so much other corruption in that area surrounding this case. But then again, it made me wonder, why is it so surprising that she's doing what appears to be the right thing? Shouldn't that be expected of everyone who works in the justice system? Now, I just cannot help but wonder, what does Judge Hill know about those duct tape DNA results? Because remember, 20 years ago, there was DNA present on that duct tape, just not enough for a profile. But DNA testing has come a long way. So I really wonder, was the DNA result inconclusive? Or did they get a full DNA profile that does not match Scott? And is that why the judge almost seemed to backtrack on her original ruling about the van fire being separate from the case? Because I'll tell you what, guys, there does seem to be a change in tone here, in my opinion, from the judge. And I'm really wondering if those DNA results are what caused that change of tone. I mean, the judge doesn't come out and call the van fire evidence being suppressed a Brady violation, but I'll tell you what, at this point, I'm really wondering if he can get this entire case dismissed based on this. Now, what do you all think? I mean, this is a lot, right? Do you think those DNA results came back proving not to be Scott? Do you think the state will try to say the duct tape wasn't related to the murder, even though it was clearly adhered to Laci's pants prior to her going in the water? Do you think Scott will get a new trial? Do you think he'll get the whole entire case dismissed? Let me know what you all think in the comment section down below. I will continue to try and give updates on this case as soon as I can, but that's going to be it for me today. If you have gotten any use out of this video, please take a second to subscribe so we don't lose each other. It costs nothing and it would mean so much to me to have your support along the way. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Be careful out there.